it's great to see everybody here. I'm very happy to be here to talk about the research that I've done, a lot of it with Kenyon students. And when I cite a student up here, I'll make it clear that it's a student with a star by their name. So first, some acknowledgments. I want to thank Linda Smolak, who I have done a lot of research with over the years. 24 of the manuscripts out there that have my name on them also have her name on them, and she's been a great colleague. That's almost half of the stuff that I've published. And I've also been lucky to do research with Michael Levine. They've been great colleagues over the years. I'm very sorry that they're no longer in the department, but happy for them in their retirement. I'm also very grateful to have an endowed chair, which allows for a little extra time to do research and a little extra funding. But we do have great funding to do research at Kenyon. One of the reasons I was attracted to a place like Kenyon was the ability to be able to balance teaching with research. So we have great support, including yearly funding as well as internal grants that we can apply for. Kenyon Summer Science Program has sponsored some of the research that you'll hear about tonight. So I thank all of them. So, my research recently, the most recent thing that we've published has to do with characters in children's popular culture. So I don't know if you're familiar with these characters, but this one is a Monster High doll. And this is a rendition of the Joker from Batman. There have been other Jokers that don't look quite this aggressive. But I think you can see that they are presented in very gender stereotyped ways. The Monster High doll is, somewhat sexually objectified. In fact, the pole that she comes on looks suspiciously like a stripper pole. And her spine is permanently curved, which is a sign of sexual availability. And I think you can see that the male character looks quite angry and aggressive. Come on in, guys. So what we did in this study was we looked at a variety of characters in children's popular culture. We looked at 443 depictions that included dolls and action figures. It included Halloween costumes, the most popular ones that we found in internet searches. And it also included Valentines, thanks to Sabina Hawks, Irene Lopez and Tom Hawks' daughter, who couldn't believe she was 8 at the time, I think, how sexually objectified the Valentines were. So we included those in our study. And this is a little bit of the data that we found. So what you see here are the percentage of characters who had different kinds of characteristics, with the green meaning the female characters and the purple the male. One basic distinction between the characters was between what the clothing they were wearing. So almost all of the female characters were wearing decorative clothing, which is clothing that's just designed to look at the person. It doesn't help you do anything. So you might consider like the ball gown that a Disney princess would wear. Whereas for the male characters, almost all of them have functional clothing, which would be like a uniform or something that allows them to engage in motion or actually do something. What we also saw in these depictions that was quite troubling was for the female characters, there were a lot of sexually objectifying characteristics that were true of these characters in children's popular culture. So revealing clothing was quite common, like a low-cut dress or very short skirt. The curved spine that I talked about, which is a cue about sexual availability, and the head canted to the side makes somebody look not very serious. That is a lot of work in advertising has looked at these kinds of depictions. And in the male characters, what we saw was a much more active presentation. So the body in motion, but we also saw what we called hypermasculinity, cues of aggression. It was very common to see a weapon present. Over half of the depictions, a weapon was present, and also the hands and fist. So why is this an important issue? Well, first of all, some of those characteristics are not negative in and of themselves. If you think of feminine stereotype characteristics like being emotional or being nurturing, that's not a bad thing. We want some people to be emotional and nurturing. If you think of some male stereotype characteristics like assertiveness, the body in motion, that's not a bad thing. But when they're polarized, when they're only true for one gender, not the other, what it doesn't do, it doesn't challenge our power structure. And male characteristics are associated with power, whereas female characteristics are not. But further, what was troubling is that the extreme gender roles that are evident in children's popular culture. So among the females, we saw what we called hyperfemininity, and that is the idea that women are supposed to be sex objects. And we know that in actual people who have hyperfeminine attitudes, that it is related to treating oneself as a sex object. And that's not healthy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Hypermasculinity was very evident in the male characters, and in people, hypermasculinity relates to aggression. In one study that I did with some Kenyon students, we put together all the data on this issue, and men who adhere to very hypermasculine attitudes, that aggression is a way to solve problems, that you should sexually objectify women, it's related to self-report of sexual aggression. And just to give you some statistics about sort of the extremes of these gender roles, more than 1.5 million people had invasive cosmetic surgery in 2014. And do you want to guess what percentage were women? Anyone? 87% of those surgeries were women. And of the more than 1.5 million people in prison in 2014, do you want to guess the percentage that were men? 93% were men. So you can sort of see that extreme gender roles, are perhaps related to that, and it's problematic. But a little bit on cultural influence. So these products, they aren't going to directly cause people to go out and do things. But what we do know from cognitive social learning theory is that children do learn gender stereotype behavior through observing in the culture and having their own gendered behavior rewarded. There's lots of rewards for different types of gendered behavior. I could talk on and on about that, but I won't. We also know from a theory called cultivation theory that things that get repeated in the culture, like through television, come to be seen as normal. So if you see these extreme gender roles, you might think this is just the way things always have been and always should be. There have been specific experiments with toys, children playing with toys and seeing the effect on behavior. These are short-term kinds of studies, but sometimes, Barbie has been the subject of research because of her very unrealistic body proportions. And in some studies, it is associated with lower body esteem, but not always. In that later study, some people thought, well, maybe the effects are already there, by the time they studied these girls. But actually, Barbie is not the worst anymore. I mean, the Monster High doll and others like that, the Bratz dolls, are probably worse in some ways in terms of the way they're depicting females. But another study, a recent one, found that playing with Barbie, whether she was career Barbie or, model Barbie, it didn't matter. Playing with her versus the group that played with Mrs. Potato Head, they imagined a lower number of careers as possible for girls. Yeah. Mrs. Potato Head, who knew? But and who thought of a potato head to begin with? But apparently it doesn't affect people's career choices. So another study looked at boys and girls exposed to superheroes on television and found that both boys and girls were more likely to engage in aggressive play. More effects on the boys than the girls. So that's just a little bit about our most recent study and a little context, and I want to talk a little bit more about other research that we've done, because a lot of it is focused more on females, and particularly with this issue of sexual objectification. Just an example of sexual objectification. This is an ad that came out in the late 2000s. It's an ad for shoes, or you might not guess that. And when I was trying to recall this ad, I did a Google search for ad with a woman in the trunk of the car. This is not the first one that comes up. It's really very sad. But just a definition of sexual objectification. Basing women's primary value on their sexual appeal to men and defining that appeal based on very narrow standards of attractiveness. You're probably aware that there's a thin ideal, that women are supposed to be unrealistically thin. And that ideal hasn't always been in our culture. Recent research has looked at the possibility of an increased sexualization of women in the culture. This is one study that was done. They examined Rolling Stone magazine covers over 40 years and found that while only 44% of women were sexualized in the 60s, that it increased to 83%, and that many women were hypersexualized, multiple sexualizing cues. Probably you could guess that there are multiple ones there. She's laying down, she's nearly naked, etc. But what has been more of a concern recently is the possibility that this is affecting girls. So this was a 2011 but depiction in French issue of Vogue that garnished a lot of media attention. And there were a lot of things happening around that time period. And so the American Psychological Association had a task force report on the sexualization of girls. And our first study, at least the first one I was involved in, maybe Linda had one before that, but I'm not aware of, was on this topic, was cited in the report. And at that time, we had become concerned about the sexual objectification of women in the culture. Jennifer Lopez, Britney Spears, et cetera, were showing up in pictures with, midriff tops. It looks tame compared to how it looks today, but it looked kind of shocking in the late 90s. And so we did the study with grade school girls and boys. And so the grade school girls saw pictures of famous women in these sexually objectified poses that passed an ethics committee. They weren't horrible. And we asked them what they thought of these pictures. And what we found was that even in grade school, girls had a very consistent response, as if they had a schema about this. They understood that women were sex objects and they had to respond to it. And we found that the girls who rejected the pictures had the highest body esteem of any group. Now the boys, in contrast, didn't seem to have a schema. They might respond to one of the pictures with, I don't like his shorts, but here's the thing about that. At that time, we couldn't find famous pictures of men with their shirts off in the media. It didn't exist. I think today we would definitely find that, and we might find different responses of boys, because certainly there's been increased objectification of boys and men. But that was our first study on this topic with Andy Mills and Lindsay Good. We're still in contact, a lot of contact with Andy. And the task force called for more research. And so we did start more of this around 2010. So one of our first studies, continuing in this theme, looked at the possibility of sexualized clothing for girls. And these are underwear that are designed for girls 9 to 12 that Victoria's Secret put out. And they are somewhat sexualized. Now, they're called Bright Young Things. That's the line of underwear. And so in the first study, what we did was we looked at clothing that was available for preteens on the websites of a bunch of different stores. And I should say Samantha Gooden looked at a lot of this, and Alyssa Vandenberg, over 6,000 clothing items. And we came up with a definition of sexualization in clothing, because it didn't exist. And it was clothing that is designed to emphasize a sexualized body part. So, maybe a dress that's cut to make it look like the girl has breasts. Or it reveals a sexualized body part, really short skirt, or midriff showing, something like that. Or it has, it's clothing that's associated with sexiness. So it's made out of slinky material. It kind of looks like lingerie. So what we did was looked at the clothing and categorized it as either childlike or definitely sexualizing. There was nothing childlike about it, or ambiguously sexualizing, which is mostly what we saw. So this AS refers to the ambiguously sexualizing, and then the DS is the definitely sexualizing. The good news is most of the clothing was childlike, but in some stores it was not. And tween stores are stores that are designed particularly for that age group. And maybe they have an older equivalent. So the worst store that we saw was Abercrombie Kids, where over 70% of the clothing items had sexualizing characteristics. So that was some evidence that this was occurring. In another study that we did, we looked at girls' magazines to see if we could chart that increase in sexualization across time in depictions of girls. I think that's me, hopefully not. Just like it had been seen with women. So just to show you some depictions from 17 magazine, that was one of the magazines we chose, and you can probably guess the more recent version. And 17 was chosen because that's a really popular magazine. It's been around for a long time, since 1944. It's been the subject of a lot of research. Last time I checked, it had over 2 million, subscriptions, which is high for one of these magazines. And so that was one that we chose. And this comparison is, I'm trying not to wear my glasses, 1971. Well, we went from 1971 to 2011. But then we also looked at Girls' Life. Not a very popular magazine, but it was designed to try to be something different than a fashion magazine when it first came out in 1994. They weren't going to be celebrity focused or appearance focused, but look at the difference across time, just to see. That's the very first issue that came out. This is a later issue which has a celebrity on the cover. Now, Probably they needed to do this for their circulation. So, when I talk about these things, this is a whole cultural issue. It's not just Girls Life magazine, but it is interesting that to survive, probably, they had to increase their sexualization. Well, here's what the actual data shows. So what we did was we got a little more specific in our coding of sexualization by the time we did this, and we counted the number of sexualizing cues. So those are things like, let's see, clothing made of slinky fabric, being tight, low cut, midriff bearing, wearing high heels, animal print fabric, and some other things. But this is the average number of characteristics per depiction in the magazines across time. And what you can see is a definite increase. 17 had more than Girls Life, which is for older girls, so that makes sense. So what we found across the time for 17, that it almost tripled, but in Girls Life, because of that very low number at the beginning, it increased like by 15 times. So barely one characteristic, 0.14 in Girls Life at the beginning, up to 2.11 by the end. Now, also something interesting about the data, there were not a lot of depictions of minority girls in any of these magazines across time, but we hypothesized that they would be shown with more sexualizing characteristics, and that was found to be true, slightly more true. On average, 1.91 compared to 1.61. So, what are the consequences of this? Well, showing these sexualized depictions and just this general focus on appearance in general encourages self-objectification. So there's a theory called objectification theory that's been tested a great deal that suggests that the ubiquitous objectification of women leads women to engage in self-objectification, where they're monitoring their body, always thinking about it, and it leads to body shame because the standards are unrealistic. It influences cognitive functioning when people are spending that effort thinking about their body, and in turn is associated with eating disorders and depression. But further, in terms of sexualization, the sexualized role is somewhat incompatible with other roles. We know from stereotype research that there are stereotypes of the non-traditional woman today, who is a career woman, the traditional woman, who is, homemaker, and then the sexy woman. And there's the biggest difference between the sexy woman and the non-traditional woman. We can't quite seem to fit those together very well, at least in the research that's been done so far. It's a little dated. In a study that we did with a scale that measures self-sexualization, we found that college women, including Kenyon women, who engage in self-sexualization, who engage in a lot of these behaviors to appear sexy, are more likely to think that women should have limited roles in society, to have benevolent sexist beliefs. So we think it's a limiting role for women. We also know from research with adult women that when you show one group of people, a woman who's in a sex object role, she's sexualized in some way, compared to another group that sees her in some other way, maybe in her athletic uniform or in professional clothing, that the women who are sexualized are seen as less competent and moral. Whoops, I forgot to put the reference there, but there's lots of research there. So let's think about girls. Would the sexualization affect girls? So can you imagine this girl to be competent and intelligent? Yeah. How about when she looks this way? So we did a study where we got this depiction off the internet and exchanged the head for the clothes. We didn't want to put a girl in this kind of position. And we asked Kenyon college students in different groups to evaluate this 5th grade girl, who we also gave a little description of her, so there was something they could hopefully think they were basing it on, at least. So either she was average in accomplishment or high in accomplishment. She was either sexualized or she was not. And this is a little bit of the data here that you can see that when she's dressed in the childlike clothing, that she's perceived as more intelligent than the sexualized clothing, particularly if she's average in accomplishment. And then she's also judged to be less moral if she's dressed in this. She's in 5th grade. And what was interesting is we told the participants our hypotheses at the end of the study, and we asked them to comment on it. And a number of them were really conscious of the fact that they were stereotyping. So this is kind of a blatant stereotype. I'll just give you a couple of comments. She would have seemed intelligent if she were not wearing such a skimpy and inappropriate outfit. She's inappropriately dressed. 5th grade girls don't need purses. Seems like a caricature of a Bratz doll. Overall, first impression isn't strong. You know, we also always ask Kenyon students to guess our hypotheses, and some of them guessed quite well, and there were some very funny things, like people knew exactly what we were doing. And we sometimes rule out those data if we think that, you know, they're trying to give us something we want. But so this is an issue that, you know, imagine that girls who, and I don't blame girls for being interested in this kind of clothing, by the way, or parents, you know. I mean, I think we think it's harmless, especially what you found with the girls' clothing is that sometimes these sexualizing characteristics are mixed with childlike things, like a polka dot print. You know, what's the harm in that? But, you know, it's possible that it is leading girls to be perceived in a particular way. But it's very popular. So, what about change? What about resistance and change on this issue? Well, yes, people should be taught to critique this, to critique culture, to resist sexualized culture. You know, there's a lot of media literacy programs that teach this. That's definitely a good thing to do. We can promote alternative self-definitions. In one of the meta-analyses that we've done, it was found that across 26 studies, that feminist identity is linked with better body image. It's not a huge effect, but it's there. And partly, perhaps, because feminist identity is also linked with less internalization of these media ideals. So feminist women have learned to critique these ideals and perhaps not use them to judge themselves. So we definitely need more critique. Promoting mind-body connection, you know, if people are taught to use their, you know, recognize what their body can do rather than what it looks like, that is helpful. A good thing. Meredith teaches yoga, that's a good thing. But individual change, or these kinds of changes, are not enough, I would argue, that they're just dealing with some of the symptoms. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the study with the boys' characters is to see how these things relate together. Because, you know, part of the female sexual objectification role is related to what's happening with boys. So I want to backtrack and talk a little bit about why there is female sexual objectification to begin with. Of course, there are various theories on it, but I'm talking about my favorite since I'm up here today. And it does have empirical support. So first of all, we still have a patriarchal culture where men have more control over resources. And one theory about how we got there is the social role theory by Alice Agley and her colleagues. One of whom is a former Kenyon student, Amanda Diekman, whose name you'll hear up here in a minute. And according to this theory, you know, we start out, we definitely, there are biological differences. Women are able to bear children and feed them from their bodies, and men have greater upper body strength. And that became important in agricultural and then industrialized societies. It led people into certain roles, with men's roles being more outside the home, more in control of resources, leading to patriarchy. And then what they argue, according to this theory, is when people get placed into roles, they then develop personality characteristics that help them succeed in those roles. So, you know, when men are placed in nurturing roles, they can nurture just as well as women. When women are placed in work roles, they can behave similarly to men. So the role is what determines the behavior. And then there's lots of other social processes that happen to help reinforce these stereotypes, some of which I'm talking about today. And then another thing about roles between men and women, sexism is a different form of prejudice compared to other forms of prejudice, because the people who are, you know, sort of competing in some ways or are targets of stereotypes want to come together. So we have heterosexual interdependence that a lot of men and women are going to want to come together for, you know, obviously to enjoy one another's company. So male dominance needs to coexist with heterosexual interdependence. So we have some strange ideas about gender. So while we have some negative stereotypes about women, we also really like women more than we like men. So we have this idea that women are warm and wonderful. Maybe they're not fit to be leaders the same way men are. But so we've got some both negative and positive stereotypes about men as well. So we have kind of conflicted ideas about gender roles. But it helps maintain some of this sexism. So what we have is a gendered sexual script. We have ways that men and women come together that are not equal. We still have a sexual double standard, that men are sexual actors and women are sexual objects. And we have this idea that men want sex and, you know, will use resources to get it, and women want relationships. And their power, perhaps, is to use their own bodies, to put themselves in the sex object role. Well, I had a student who was very interested in this gendered sexual script and wasn't evident in what children are being exposed to in the culture. And so there had been a study that came out that looked at this on primetime television, if anybody remembers what that is, since it doesn't really. But they looked at a number of instances of various elements of this gendered sexual script on primetime television. And she said, well, I'm going to see, what I see if I watch children's television. And so these are programs for, preteen maybe, teenagers, iCarly, Drake and Josh. Some of you guys might know those shows. So she looked at the number of elements of the script per hour, and again, I'm only showing you some of the data. So her data, children's TV, this is Alexandra Kirsch, and then compared it to adult dramas and adult sitcoms from the other study that I should have cited, which is Kim et al. And this sex as masculinity was the most common cue in any show, and what it means is that men are all about sex, that they are often objectifying women, talking about sex, talking about women's bodies. Well, on children's television, there's no sex taking place, but what she found was that all the interactions between the males and females on the show were very sexualized, very flirtatious. No instances where boys and girls were friends, doing something, like an adventure together or anything like that. So very sexualized interactions, somewhat similar to adult television, even though no sex is actually taking place. That's a male courtship strategy, which is, men sort of showing off resources or showing off that they're a good singer on some of those shows, I guess. And female courtship is women sexually objectifying themselves, girls in this case, treating themselves as sex objects. Good girl is part of the script where women are supposed to set the limits on men's sexual activity. So thankfully that's, we're not seeing a lot of that on children's television. But the point is that while there's something going on with the female sex object role, there's also something going on with this male sex actor role that's important and hasn't really been given the same type of research attention. So in other research, we talk about the fact that there are body ideals out there that are very gendered and part of this gendered sexual script that are made to seem, like that's what if you look like this body, you will be successful in the heterosexual world. And so Brian, Don, and I have written about body ideals for both women and men and how they, are very consistent with this idea. While there's been an increased thinness and sexualization of women across time, there's also been an increased muscularity of the images of men. If you look at a G.I. Joe from the 1970s, he looks totally different than the G.I. Joe today that has very unrealistic musculature. So these body ideals, I think, tell us something about the gender pressures in our culture. But Rita Seabrook and I also note that the appearance demands are still greater for women. It's still more important to women's gender role to focus on appearance, but it's certainly an issue for men. Now, getting back to the children's characters, you can sort of see the eroticized body ideals here that, Batman looks very muscular there, and the language is very different, and then we see these Disney fairies. Now, interestingly, if you haven't seen boys' Halloween costumes lately, they now come with a muscular version of many of the costumes. So there'll be like regular Spider-Man and muscular Spider-Man. That didn't used to exist. So there's a lot of pressure on boys concerning their bodies. And we think this pressure has something to do with an emphasis on hypermasculinity, while there's this increased sexualization of women. So something Hope Boyd and I are doing, she's one of the authors of that study I cited at the beginning, is we're looking at the data from the children's characters in a little more detail to see, do we see these unrealistic body ideals? You saw the way that they're portrayed in stereotyped ways. Well, so we took the female characters and we contrasted the thin, noticeably thin characters. They're all thin, really, or at least average in body type, but really thin, which is 71% of them, 95 of the characters. Depictions, and compared to non-thin. And what you see is the thin characters in pink have more sexualizing characteristics associated with them. So they're more likely to have revealing clothing, the curved spine posture, the head cant, to be wearing high heels. And then for the male characters, we looked at the number that were noticeably muscular, and that's a little over half. 52% are noticeably muscular. And we found that the more muscular characters are associated with some of the more hypermasculine cues like hands and fists, angry facial expression. So we think that these eroticized body ideals are associated with sort of hyper-femininity and hyper-masculinity. Now for a little data on Kenyon students. In this study, we asked Kenyon students a lot of things, but to also indicate how important was it, these are all the heterosexual participants in this part only, how important was it for your partner to have the ideal body type? You know, this thin ideal for women, this muscular ideal for men. And so for the Kenyon men, we found that the men who thought it was more important for their woman partner to have this ideal, they were more likely to prefer a hookup culture to relationships, and that's a correlation value. They were more likely to have a sexualized peer group, which is a group that talks a lot about sex and who they've had sex with and compares notes, suggests people, you know, suggests possible partners to each other. They were also more likely to watch reality television and to watch sports on television. Now, these are not causal relationships, they're correlations, but what it suggests to us is that, you know, there is a culture out there that's encouraging us to, you know, evaluate other people based on appearance. Now for the women, results were not quite as strong in the women, but what we found was that women who thought it was more important for their man partner to have an ideal body were also more likely to prefer the hookup culture. Smaller correlations, but those of you in stats, they're significant because it's a pretty large sample size. To have the sexualized peer group and to believe that relationships are adversarial, this one was strange to us. So what this scale measures is that you think that men and women are sort of out to get one another in a relationship. And we couldn't quite understand, I mean, that's not a huge correlation, but it was the strongest one for the women. And what we came up with is that maybe women who believe that and are in that kind of culture, you know, are being judged by their bodies, and so they think it's fair play to judge men by their bodies. I don't know. Some good news about the data, though, which you find in many studies, is that most people are much nicer when they evaluate a partner's body than the way they evaluate their own body. So, like the ideal that men had for women was very similar to women's actual body size, whereas the ideal women have for themselves is much thinner. Same was true for the men, that the ideal body they have for themselves is much more muscular, but the one that women have for men is similar to men's actual bodies. So why are we all doing this to each other? But so another part that I want to address is, so I feel like this female sexual objectification is partly related to what's going on with the male role. We shouldn't, you know, ignore what's happening with men. But why increased sexual objectification? Well, some people have argued that it's because we live in a half-changed world, that the second wave of the women's movement did lead to an increase of women in the workforce and a lot of changing roles for women, but not so much for men. So there have been some changes in men's roles, but perhaps not enough. One of my former students, Amanda Diekman, for her honors project in Psych, looked at non-sexist books versus sexist books. And these were award-winning books. And what she found was that you could distinguish the books on the basis of only what the female characters were doing. That the female characters in non-sexist books were taking on, you know, more stereotypic masculine roles of action and adventure and so on. But you couldn't distinguish what the boys were doing in these books. Amanda was a double major in English and Psych, so she thought of a creative way to put those together. Some people have talked about why that it might be a backlash against women's accomplishments, that we are now, you know, trying to push these very extreme gender roles as a way to try to return things more to what society thinks is normal. Certainly, it could have something to do with what people call the pornification of culture. The easy availability of pornography on the internet has meant that it's kind of made its way into mainstream culture. That, you know, we probably wouldn't have thong underwear for preteens advertised by Victoria's Secret if, you know, it didn't exist somewhere before that and people have now seen it. Also, just the general commercialization of culture. That there's a lot of pressure, you know, to buy products. And, you know, if advertising can make people feel insecure, they might buy a product. So there certainly is this increased commercialization of culture. And some people feel like we are more vulnerable to this than ever before because in our industrialized society, we're less likely to need to use our bodies for our jobs, for our work. And that could make us vulnerable to body dissatisfaction, that we aren't, you know, using our bodies in physical ways. And there are lots of products available for people to try to manipulate their bodies. So a mere commercialization of culture could be part of this too. Not a mere commercialization of culture. do with all of this? Sorry, it's changed our mind. So I'm trying to talk about this systemically now, that we need to look at all these roles and we need to look at what's going on in society. And what I think we need to do is challenge what Sandra Bem called the 3 lenses of gender in a book that she wrote. And she says that there are 3 particular ways that we look at gender that are problematic. One is we engage in this gender polarization where we cast everything male and female as opposite. Even the term the opposite sex is an example of that. And we have a cognitive tendency to do that. Anytime we have 2 of something, we have more than 2 genders. But people tend to think we have 2 and cast them as opposite. So we can be taught to recognize gender similarity. There is far more similarity than there is difference. Janet Hyde did a huge meta-analysis of all the meta-analyses of gender difference, and most of the gender differences are either quite small or non-significant. So there's a lot more similarity than most people realize. And a lot of those, even that aren't small, vary by historical time period, by the context in which you test people. And Sandra Bem later in her thinking came to think that we really need to proliferate these gender and sexuality categories so that people will stop, using just this gender binary. Challenge the gendered sexual script that I talked about. Another way that we look at gender, though, is to assume that what is male is better. That's androcentrism. And we do need more critique of the male role. A lot of this content analysis research that I talked about has looked at girls and women for good reason. People are concerned about the way women are shown in the media. But there's a lot of critique of the male role that needs to happen also, because I think they do fit together. And we need more critique of situations that encourage hypermasculinity. Also, biological essentialism. We need to avoid simplistic biological explanations for gender behavior. It's a lot more complex than that, but it's really easy for us to latch on to biological explanations. And there are huge best-selling books out there about these supposed huge differences in behavior that just don't exist, and based on a lot of bad science. There's good critique out there, too. So basically, we want more of this. Okay? We want people to be free to take on other roles. Now, people are starting to complain, though, about the way that children are being stereotyped in the culture, and we have seen some changes as a result. So I'll just end with a couple of perhaps positive changes. Target tried to make their toy aisles more gender neutral without the labels after a mother complained about a girl's building set that was very stereotypically feminine. So I don't know if you are aware that when the Star Wars action figures came out from the new movie, they did not have depictions of this, very important female character. I haven't seen the movie, but people complained, and now there is, this action figure. They shouldn't have had to complain, but I also want to mention my current research students, if any of them are here. I saw some of them, Jen and others, who are doing research, but it's not up here because it hasn't been published yet, but we'll keep trying. And I have references, but are there any questions? Yeah.
So we were deciding what features to look at for what muscular versus whatnot. How did you come up with those features?
Those sexualized features?
Yeah.
Well, in the previous study, well, that one's not published yet, so we hope the reviewers like what we're doing. But in the other study, we talked about some characteristics being traditionally feminine that don't really have anything to do with sexual objectification, like a friendly smile on a doll's face, versus hyper-feminine, and we had a good argument for that. And then we had traditionally masculine, like the body in motion is not necessarily aggressive, so that was a more traditional. Then we had hyper-masculine. So we're kind of focusing in now on those hyper-feminine and hyper-masculine that we want to contrast those with. But we did look at, for the female characters who were thin versus not thin, we also looked at, did they compare in any other way, like on the masculine characteristics, and they don't. The only ones where they differ are these sex object characteristics. So it does seem to be that that's the image that's supposed to be coming forth, I guess. Yes, Liz?
So I was wondering, I was struck by the sort of stereotyping that went on certainly through most of the 20th century, of race by stereotype. And we slowly moved out of it. And what comes to mind is in an example, we would be horrified if we saw an image of Fu Manchu as some sort of image of how we should consider Asian. But we don't seem to be horrified that I've noticed lately that there's not a woman shown in power on TV. Now I still watch TV.
Without cleavage showing?
Without cleavage and extremely high heels. She would not be considered feminine. So we're not horrified by that, but we would never show a Fu Manchu again. Are we going to get to that point? Do you think?
Where we, well, I don't,
we don't care what someone wears doesn't establish their sympathy.
I think some people care what she's wearing, but I think that that sexualized image is it's sold to people as a form. It's sold to young women as a form of power. There's not a lot of evidence that it really is, though. I mean, they might feel individually that they look great and they should be proud of their bodies. I mean, I don't blame them for wanting to feel that way. But for women as a group, it's probably not helpful. It probably does lower their status. It does probably lead us to perceive them as less competent when they are sexualized. I mean, that's what the research seems to suggest. So, I don't know. Maybe there's a time where we will get used to it, though, and it won't lead us to think somebody is not competent. But what seems to happen is we just seem to form these subtypes of people in terms of our stereotyping of women and also of men. That we don't really challenge the stereotype as a whole.
Don't you think we did eventually for racial stereotyping?
Yeah, but I think that's different because we don't.
It's solved.
I think the reason sexism is more challenging in some ways on that issue is that it gets eroticized. Like it's made to seem like it's really that this is the way to be, because of this heterosexual interdependence. So if women are in a lower status position, I mean, one thing they do have is their sex appeal. So, and there are positive things a lot of positive things associated with that, but not competence. So it's kind of a trade-off. And we did a study that I didn't cite here, it's a long time ago, Melanie Machiner and I, where we had a woman give a speech, and she portrayed herself as either a sex object or not. Not extremely feminist, but she talked about liking to flirt with men, and no pictures of her, just giving the speech. And what we found was that the men who heard the woman who was the sex object did not think she was competent, but they agreed with her more than the men who heard the same speech given by the not sex object. So that's what women often have to do, is sort of trade off, being liked versus being respected. So it's hard for those things to get the right balance. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I noticed that the hypersexualization of the male forms has started a sharp increase roughly when we went to war. And we've pretty much been at war the entire period. That has continued and increased, and I'm wondering if anybody, I know you, but do you know of any studies that are also looking at what that role, I mean, if we want warriors, I mean.
Right, then we have to have
then
this
we have
powerful,
to create
yeah.
people who are willing to go to war and protect the weak women, and, I mean, I just feel like that's some impact.
Yeah.
Potentially.
And there's cultural variation in the emphasis on the muscular body, which Linda probably knows more about than I do. But that study that you guys did of men's male role norms, did that also have to do with their bodies? It was a different, they did a cross-cultural study, and there's definitely variability in what we consider important in the male role across cultures, and I'm sure it has something to do with the size of the military and how much we need military strength. And I know Eileen Zerbriggen has written about that too. Yeah, Scott.
Obviously, Barbie was on the cover of Time magazine recently.
Yes.
I'm
I'll
curious-
show the new images of Barbie, though. They have come out with some wider body types recently.
I'm curious, I mean, is the media doing a better job of covering this issue, or is that coverage still problematic? I mean, when Target made those changes, there was some media coverage.
Yeah, and I do think social media, is having an influence. Like, people spread these ideas around. Young people are spreading these ideas around, which I think is great. And I also think, with the, with various sexual minority groups fighting for rights and representation, that's having a positive effect on gender stereotypes. I hope. Yeah.
Hey. I have a question about the existence
Can you tell me what you mean or an idea that you
What
have?
I mean, can change the stereotype that someone who looks sexy is less intelligent.
Maybe, and maybe that is changing. Like, I don't know what effect it's having to see all these, female physicians on television with cleavage. I don't know. Maybe that will change. It would be really interesting to do a study to compare, like, older adults who aren't college students, how they would stereotype sexualized versus non-sexualized women compared to people your age. I think that would be a good study for somebody to do.
What role do you think uniforms in schools for primary and middle school children have on their relationship with their bodies and the sexualization that might occur later on in their lives?
Well, I think it's a good idea not to focus on what clothes you're wearing so much, but I hear that people find ways to do that anyway, right? What do you think?
I don't know. I think that eventually, usually in high school, kids might get to a school that does require uniform, and the entire influence of the media that they see their whole lives might just about that.
Yeah.
Be the goal that they decide to play.
Well, I think it's, you can talk about behavior at the individual level. I can understand why people want to wear this kind of clothing, et cetera. But what I'm concerned with is why are we encouraging this at the cultural level? Like, I don't want to blame individual people, I want people to have informed consent, though. The thing about girls is, young girls, like, they don't have the cognitive capacity to make decisions about this the same way that young women do. So I think pushing this on them early in a culture where there is, child sexual abuse is not a good idea. I don't understand the point of that.
Do you see this as mostly a North American view, or is it also
No.
equal to Western Europe as well?
Yes, definitely. And they're doing more about this in some other countries like the United Kingdom and Australia, but they certainly are doing research like this as well and see the same issue. Yeah.
When you say critique the male role, what does that look like? What does that mean more specifically?
Well, I think this hypermasculinity, like what kind of situations encourage that? Why do we have so many toys with guns? Like, why, what's that about? And I think, that's definitely something parents can do, is not have their kids play with weapons, or critique why does this character need a weapon? Yeah, what do you think?
Okay, well, yeah, I can think of like a lot of different people who would respond differently to that question. So, one kind of person might say, well, boys just like playing with guns. And it's, maybe that's true because of the culture, or maybe it's true because they just like playing with weapons, because all the stories they get are about playing with weapons. And it's hard to just completely change the culture. It takes time, of course. On the other hand, you might have the people making those toys and making it saying, we're just selling to the market. And I was thinking a lot about sort of the marketing side. How much do you think of the marketing side is conscious, saying we're going to consciously sexualize these things, we're going to consciously hypermasculinize because it sells better.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it's conscious, but yeah. Well, actually, there is a film that I show sometimes that looks at, it's called The Codes of Gender. It's by the Media Education Foundation, and it talks about really the stereotypes in advertising that, actually a lot of the research that I showed here came from that original research by a sociologist named Irving Goffman in the 1970s. But it does show some people who, own companies being really conscious of the way that they're depicting women and thinking that this is the right role for women to be sex objects only. So, I don't know. Some people are probably pretty conscious, others probably not. And again, I don't blame people for being interested in it. And those Monster High dolls that are very sexualized, there's some ways in which I think they're better than some of the other dolls because they're kind of sassy. They're not passive. I'm not sure they're better. I'd like to see more research on what kids actually do with these things because, they can do a lot of different things with them. But I don't know. So that's kind of interesting about them. They're not passive, for sure. But I don't know who had their hand up. But yeah.
You talk a lot about how this applies to the heteronormative community. I'm just wondering if you know any studies
Well, I mean, what we do know is that gender roles are much stricter for boys than they are for girls. And there are lots of girls who, report playing with male stereotype toys and not receiving flack for it or not, and having more flexible gender roles related to sexuality. I think it's probably more difficult for gay men. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I don't know. I think something that just came to mind was how you're talking about heterosexual women perceive men. I think it's just interesting to think about how gay women perceive other women, and how we as women put pressure on each other to be sexy.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
I was thinking about the characters because when I taught gender and popular culture last semester, and I see some of the students from that class, there aren't any characters in children's popular culture that I know of that are like, obvious, where everybody knows that they're gay. But people think that maybe Daphne on Scooby-Doo was, and she got a makeover. It became much more sexualized, and it made people mad. And did they go back to changing her back the way she was? I don't remember. But I don't know. I don't know what kind of representations are out there for people who don't feel like they like what's out there. The representations for girls are getting, these are still, there's some action figures that just came out for girls that DC Comics. I don't know if these are better. They're a little bit sexualized. Their body proportions, I think, are a little better. I think the class thought these were better, who talked about them last semester. I don't know. What? Yeah. Prepubescent girls have legs that long. Any other? Yeah.
I was wondering in your research if you've ever looked at the effects of the race of the dolls and the classes being portrayed. I think a lot of the Bratz dolls, about 6 months ago, there was this big trend on Instagram of doing a doll make under, which is where most of the time it was the Monster High dolls, the Bratz dolls that were given a make under, so they were repainted to be
Yeah.
less sexualized. And I know many people, especially people of color, were rightfully pissed off that this representation of a more urban culture, of a
Right.
more racialized culture, was being taken away.
Yeah.
So have you looked at that at all?
No, and I just became aware, actually, so in my Psych of Women class, they did an analysis of toys recently, and a woman in the class talked about how when the Bratz dolls came out, she's Latina, they were delighted that they weren't blonde, obviously white dolls like Barbies. But they were more sexualized. She herself was not allowed to play with them. But yeah, so then they get attacked, in this task force report, the Bratz dolls in particular. So yeah, there probably is definitely racism involved in there and classism and the best dolls that we looked at were the American Girl dolls. When they first came out, they were designed to put a girl into history. They were designed by a history teacher. Now the company belongs to somebody else. It was purchased by somebody else. But those are so expensive, so there's definitely a class element there too. Yeah.
Have you looked at, or is anybody looking at how there's a big increase in children who are self-identifying as trans as children?
Yeah.
And are you looking at anything at all as to whether the increased sexualizations on both toys are leading more of them to feel like they can't belong in their gender, or versus I don't know. Or is it just that we're more comfortable as a culture that people have always? I just think it's interesting because as a girl, I was called a tomboy. At the time, I wouldn't have thought of calling myself trans. If I were 20 now, I might.
Yeah.
Because I'm more aware, because I certainly didn't identify with pretty much any of female culture, and I used to remember being 10 and wishing I didn't have boobs. So, and praying that I would never get them. I went on and I had a kid, and I'm glad I did because they served their function. But I know there's a lot more acceptability of that for women, even though we're present in many other ways. We do have more
flexible
fluidity of
gender roles
expression as children than boys, and I feel like it's gotten even less so for boys
Maybe,
when I
maybe,
was
I don't know.
a kid, and I feel like it's very hard to hold on to your identity as a boy if you like girls. I don't know if you've ever read a blog called Raising My Rainbow. I would suggest that,
Mhm.
you know, looking at that, and looking just because it's very interesting,
Yeah,
I think. So,
good, thanks. One more question? Or not? Okay, thank you.